Hello Guyana, welcome to another program of the Public Interest. Thank you very much for joining us. I am Malaika Ramsey, back with you with leader of the People's National Congress Reform and leader of the opposition, Brigadier the Honorable David Granger. Welcome, sir.
Morning, thank you.
Today we focus on another issue that has over the years seriously affected our communities, our societies, our human resources. And of course that is traffic accidents and road deaths. And Mr. Granger will shed some light on exactly how it is that we possibly can strive to preserve human life. But before we do that, Mr. Granger, what damage does the continued road accidents and road deaths do for our nation's human resources?
Well, there's massive injury. I think every year we have sometimes well over 150 road deaths, and over the last 10 years or so we've had maybe between 1,500 to 2,000 road deaths. So in terms of human life, we are losing people at a rate which is faster than many epidemic diseases. I think if you had an outbreak of gastroenteritis which kill 150 people a year, it would be alarming, but somehow people seem to have accustomed themselves to a large number of road deaths. And the greater pity is that a number of the deaths are children. Sometimes as many as 20 children die on the roads a year. I can't tell you exactly how many people would have died, how many children would have died over the last 10 years or so. But a good percentage, maybe as many as 10%, would have been children. So we are losing a lot of human resources. Many of the people are young. Many of them are pedestrians, which suggests to me that they are the poorer sort of citizens. You know, they're not rich people who are driving in big cars. These are pedestrians and cyclists. They suffer most. So I think that is the big pity. The other thing we have to remember is that these accidents injure many more people than they kill. Although we may speak about 150 or 150 deaths a year, the number of injured persons is probably 10 times as high. Now, many of the injuries will be permanent. People lose limbs, and people may lose an eye, or they may have other serious injuries. Those injuries have costs. They have to go to hospital and they spend several weeks or months in agony, and they have to pay medical expenses, and sometimes they have to travel overseas to get advanced medical treatment. So nobody has calculated the actual cost, but from what I've read, the previous Minister of Health said it is certainly the leading cause of death for persons under the age of 18. The single leading cause of death.
If I may jump in here, sir, and I would have been coming to that next. And you're a historian, as I like to say, and a researcher in your own right. And from what I've read, in 2009, road deaths was the 7th leading cause of deaths in Guyana. But from your probably research that you would have done, is that still the case? Have we not managed to reduce that number somehow?
No, the big problem is that as long as Mr. Clement Rohi remains Minister of Home Affairs, I don't expect there's going to be any reduction. Sometimes there are fluctuations, and of course when there's a reduction, the police and the Ministry of Home Affairs are very exuberant, saying, oh, road deaths have reduced, but next year the figures go up again. So I think in order to bring about a long-term reduction, we have to look at the factors which are causing the road deaths. One factor certainly is many drivers are just wild, and we need to have a system of licensing or certifying to make sure that the people behind those wheels are fit to drive vehicles. You know, they're literate, they can read road signs, they don't drink and drive, and they're likely to obey the signs and the regulations on the road. The second thing is the vehicles. Many vehicles come into this country are old vehicles, they're reconditioned, and they require much more maintenance than new vehicles. They require good tires, good brakes, and that sort of thing, and they need to be inspected. And in my view, vehicles which are to be used for commercial purposes, that they're carrying children to school or carrying passengers, to Linden, need to be driven by more experienced persons, and the vehicles themselves need to satisfy higher standards of roadworthiness. The other thing too is that I think it is possible at this point in time to determine which areas of the country are more susceptible to traffic accidents, and I think more attention has to be paid to those areas.
Now, I want to talk about public awareness, especially regarding pedestrians. But before I come to that, you mentioned something very important, that it is important for people who are going to get behind the wheel of vehicles to know, to be literate, to know the traffic signs. As someone who would have recently done those tests, I can tell you that it is provided for. So if I dare to ask you this, sir, then what is the problem? Why are our drivers, not necessarily au fait with road signs and road rules and traffic rules?
Well, I hesitate to venture into this area because the evidence is anecdotal. Several persons who might not be qualified might have gotten their licenses, fraudulently. They might have paid a clerk or somebody to get the license, or they may have failed the test and they've paid the inspecting officer to get the license. But what we need to do is recertify those persons in a more objective framework, so that the people who might have been involved in an accident will be retested. Nobody remains the same throughout his or her life. Your sight will deteriorate, you get older, and people need to be retested. So there could be fraud, there could be deterioration in persons' faculties, and some days, maybe a bus driver or a taxi driver, he may just drink too much, and sometimes they spend a long time at the car park, and they, you pass there and see people drinking Guinness or drinking beer all day, and you say, well, what's going on here? Next thing you know, a passenger comes along and he's jumping, but he's drunk because he's been drinking for several hours. He's drinking and gaffing and so on, and he's not fit to be behind the wheel. So several things can happen, which would cause a person who was once qualified to now be disqualified.
We've seen the advertisements, especially regarding the excessive use of alcohol, the damage that it can do when you do that, when you drink and drive. Should the Guyana Police Force, probably Mr. Rohim himself, should they not be given credit for these little infomercials telling you what would happen if you drink and drive? Should they not be given credit for that, or is more of that needed?
Well, there must be a combination of what they call education and enforcement. Public education is important. People, school children, of course, you have programs that, road safety programs for school children. But school children don't drive. You need road safety programs for the actual adult drivers. But you need better enforcement, because when people feel that the lights won't work or nobody's watching, they can break the rules. Maybe it might be during the hours of darkness, and a lot of accidents occur during the hours of darkness, unlike the West Demerara Highway or the Quarantine Highway. But there are other factors which we need to consider. For example, historically that there's a sort of what I call an arterial system of roads, that there's like a long artery, which used to be the front dam in the sugar estates. Those front dams were eventually upgraded to become public roads, and those public roads have been upgraded and are called highways. But in essence, they remain village roads. Some of them pass through markets. Up to this year, or maybe last year, I've still seen people drying paddy. Yes, I think people who've been to developed countries would never see people drying their farm produce on the roadways, but it's something we tolerate. When you go through Maripo or Lenora, on a market day, the road is very constricted because people park anyhow. You see animals wandering about, and it's difficult to call those roads highways because they're just village roads. So when you look at all of those factors, sometimes people are building a house, they put a pile of sand on the roadway, you try to avoid the sand and you run into an animal, you try to avoid the animal, you run into a child or something like that. It's quite chaotic. And many of the accidents happen in areas which are quite predictable. I called the area that Houston, maybe Barrettstown, Eccles area. It's a sort of death alley, Agricola, MacDoom, because there's very heavy human settlement, and particularly on weekends, there are a lot of pedestrians going from the east side of the road to the west side, and the cars just fly through that area as if it was a sort of highway. And I reckon, again, just from anecdotal evidence, quite a lot of fatalities occurred in that area between, say, Houston to Eccles, that Peters Hall, that Houston Peters Hall area. But there are other areas which are quite vulnerable as well.
Let's bring it back a bit to more of the human side, and I am going to touch a bit on public transportation here. Most times when we see these accidents, especially when the public transportation vehicles get into the accidents, we see so many deaths or so many serious injuries. Is there an argument that possibly if the public transportation system is changed, that could contribute to the reduction of road deaths, road accidents?
We've been there maybe 50 years ago. You had some very large private-owned buses. And in my recollection, they were not involved in so many accidents. It's very rare to see a big private bus involved in an accident. Many of the rural buses were blue and the urban buses were yellow. But an attempt was made to set up a state-owned transportation corporation. And lots of buses, dozens and dozens of buses were brought into the country. Some were Yugoslav, I think some were Brazilian. But it didn't work, and now instead of going back to large private buses, we've gone to these minibuses. Now, there is no public transportation system. What you have is a lot of taxi drivers and private entrepreneurs who buy a bus or two, and they run their own service. So there has been some attempt at regulating them, but I don't see that it is going to change unless you have some major investor who sets up a corporation with safe buses, large buses, without the sort of anarchy that we see on the roads today. So I don't see the state getting involved in that again. If that's what you mean by a public transportation system, I see that private entrepreneurs will continue to run the transportation system.
Okay, just to stay on this a bit. So, in your opinion, it's a case where the state can't necessarily afford it? Because I'm just thinking the cost of that, and I guess against the cost of continuing to lose our citizens.
I don't know if the state, as presently configured, can run such a corporation efficiently. Okay. I think that the era of state-owned enterprises like those, the era is coming to an end. It has ended in some other countries, and I'm not sure it's going to work anymore in Guyana.
All right. What can we possibly pattern from other, probably third world countries? Because there are third world countries where, in terms of road deaths, it's not as rampant as it is in Guyana. What can we possibly learn from them or copy from them to make our situation better and save lives at the same time?
Well, you shouldn't be surprised to know that several studies have been done on Guyana's roads, and recommendations have been made for improvement. Some of the roads are simply too narrow, they're overloaded. And if you try to go between maybe Craig Village and Georgetown on a working day, it could take you a couple of hours. In normal times, you might be able to travel that distance in 15 minutes. But it is quite likely that on a working day, you'd probably take 150 minutes, 10 times as long. What needs to be done is that attention should be paid to the studies which have been completed. The roads are overloaded, and the roads need to be widened. The surface needs to be improved so that drivers don't have to dodge potholes. And most important, pavements, what we call pavements, need to be provided, what the Americans call sidewalks. I am most concerned about protecting pedestrians. And where pedestrians are required to cross the road, there must be lit pedestrian crossings. So lights are flashing so that any approaching vehicle would know that here there's a zebra crossing, school children are crossing, pedestrians are crossing. And they should exercise due caution. I would like to see also that markets are removed from the roadsides, because these roadside markets have been there for 100 years. I'd like to see animals taken off of the roads, and people should be prohibited from dumping sand or building materials at the side of the roads. There's some areas where there's diagonal parking, so whenever the vehicle that is parked diagonally needs to come, it has to back into the traffic. And you have motorcyclists, pedestrians, dray carts, minibuses, all competing for the same road space. So there have been studies of these situations, but the government, the Ministry of Home Affairs and the Guyana Police Force seem to have ignored those studies. These are nothing new. You go to Bahamas, you go to other countries, and you don't see half the chaos. And sometimes in many Caribbean countries, the capitals are not as well laid out as Georgetown. The capitals could be very congested. The streets are very narrow. Sometimes they're hilly. But Georgetown has the benefit of having flat roads, broad parapets. But sometimes because of flooding, the pedestrians cannot walk on the pavements or the parapets. They have to walk on the roadway, So I would say that many of the problems that have been caused in Guyana by, particularly road fatalities, are preventable.
If I can use the Soos-Dijk-Linden Highway as a perfect example, and coincidentally enough, in the past 24 hours or so, we saw another accident there where 3 persons were injured, and it's reported that not far away from the crash site, there were actually police officers on the road trying to direct traffic, and we still saw that happening not far away from the crash site because of either a parked or broken down vehicle there. How do we solve the problem of specifically the Linden Highway?
Well, the Linden Highway is over 40 years old, and I think the very first accident set the pattern for all future accidents. That is, you had a parked, unlit vehicle on the dark highway, and you had 2 vehicles each approaching from different directions, and neither wanted to stop, and one ran into the parked vehicle. And that is the sort of scenario which has set the pattern for several other accidents. What it needs, certainly, some dangerous areas need to be lit. There needs to be, better enforcement, highway patrols. But most of all, you need to have drivers who are better trained and who observe the rules of the road by driving at safer speeds. And right now, the highway is probably the worst that I've ever seen it in the last 4 decades. There are actually holes on the road, and there are actually some areas which are almost like corrugated because of the weight of the trucks bringing carrying fuel or bringing timber or other heavy commodities along that highway. So the road is deteriorating. There is very little maintenance or renovation, and drivers, because of the need, particularly commercial drivers like minibuses, the need to make as many trips as possible between Georgetown and Linden, tend to go at a high rate. Now, if your vehicle has got bad tires or is mechanically unfit or unsound, sometimes you may try to dodge an obstacle or maybe a pothole, and you run into something that's approaching from the other direction.
This question may be a bit of a tough one, but 4 decades after a road like that has been built, can you possibly say why it has been so difficult for lights to be at certain points of the highway? Expense
is one, and I think the other problem, of course, is that the administration, then it comes back to the central government, the Ministry of Home Affairs, and the police force, have not seen it necessary to put up those lights. But I remember at the time of Cricket World Cup several years ago, several improvements had to be made on the road between Georgetown and Timeri to conform to international standards. If there was greater diligence on the part of the Ministry of Home Affairs, we shouldn't have to wait for Cricket World Cup to improve road lighting and road signing. So I would say that we have a pack of eye servants, people who don't act until they're forced to act, and then they imitate, other countries very late. But driving on highways now is almost international. I think persons who've been to other countries like Trinidad or Suriname, would see that the roads are properly signed, properly lit. But in Guyana, we seem to have fallen in love with backwardness. It's a great shame, that so many people keep on dying on the roads simply because of poor administration. And this is probably coming back to public awareness, and I just wanted to focus for a bit on those people who actually drive those trucks, and whether they're broken down or they're just parked there for the night. Is anything being done to possibly make them a little more aware of what is happening? Because at the end of the day, they may not necessarily be in the vehicle when it happened. They're not experiencing, look, we're losing lives, we're injuring people, and is there any way that they can pay for being, for want of a better word, being lackadaisical? Well, it's a very costly error on their part. Recklessness on the road, people are not on the road alone, they're other road users. But it has to come in at the start, that is, at the training and the testing. And I think once people are properly trained to drive and properly tested, as I said, in some cases, depending on the class of vehicles, people need to be given additional training and additional testing. For example, if a person receives a license to drive a private car, he's taking his family for a drive on a Sunday afternoon, is one matter. But if a person is driving a minibus with 12 human beings, or in some cases 20 human beings, packed into a minibus, some of them school children, the person needs a different type of license, or should need a different type of license, because he's carrying human beings. And if the person commits any infraction, like speeding or driving under the influence, that license could be suspended, or it could be revoked completely, because he's unsafe. He's not allowed to drive that class of vehicles. And of course, there are so many different types of vehicles on the roads. There, for example, the fire service has a different category of vehicle. You have ambulances, you have commercial vehicles, agricultural vehicles. One of the big problems in West Berbice is agricultural vehicles during the rice season. West Berbice is a well-known rice farming area. They bring a lot of mud on the tractor wheels, because the tractors use the main highway, which is the only highway in some cases, to move from the farm to the person's homes. They deposit clumps of mud along the road. When the rain falls, it becomes quite slippery. so that vehicles, even driving at normal speeds, could get into serious accidents when they try to stop and they maybe skid, or the vehicle becomes unstable. So I would say that lots can be done to deal with delinquents, but it comes back to enforcement. It comes back to a police force which is deployed to those vulnerable areas, which has the equipment, and it comes back to a court system which brings those people before the court. The fact is, Malaika, that too many people are dying. This is not just some sideshow. More people are dying on the roads than by some serious diseases, and we need to take decisive action at the level of the ministry and the police force to bring an end to it.
I know it's costing the people, the relatives of the people who are dying and the relatives of the people who are injured, but what really is it costing the state?
Well, I don't know, I can't give you that figure, but okay, having read what former ministers of health like Dr. Ramsamy have said, it's quite high, because I'm sure that, in what I've seen in the hospital wards, the accident wards, some of those cases probably cost about $250,000. When you look at the limbs and the duration, the medication, I think the state pays billions of dollars. I think the Ministry of Health, I'm sure, will have the figures. And this excludes the expenses in private hospitals or those who go overseas. I know a major businessman several months ago was involved in a very serious accident. He had to be flown out to Miami. I don't even know if he's come back in the countries yet. But things like that can cost hundreds of thousands of dollars.
I'd like to get your thoughts on something. We heard persons in the public complaining about the fact that, and this is coming back to the minibuses we were talking about earlier, when a driver speeds, a person may say, look, hey, you need to slow down, or whatever the case may be, and that person or those persons in that minibus or those minibuses are actually verbally abused. Some of them are even told, well, you can catch another bus. And just think of it, let's say it's a situation, I don't know, probably after 9 or after 10 at night, if it's on a highway. How is a person supposed to get out of that minibus then? I guess it's a matter of choice, but I'd like your take on it.
Well, it is a matter of choice, and many people have described that situation to me. But it starts, I think, with the training and testing of the driver and enforcement on the part of the police force in the first instance. So drivers against whom complaints are made, should be sanctioned by the law. And every vehicle has a number, and maybe drivers must be made to wear little tabs with their names. It is a serious matter. We shouldn't treat it as something frivolous. And if you have a complaint, say, look, driver Mr. ABC, driving vehicle XYZ, was exceeding the rate, and despite pleas on the part of the passengers to slow down, he refused, or he was smelling of liquor or something like that, and make that report to the police station. That is the one way in which we could deal with it. The second way, of course, is that many people who go into buses, there's only one way. You're living at Linden, this is Georgetown, it's 8 o'clock at night, there's only one way to get home. And people take the chance. Sometimes, although the bus driver is driving recklessly, there's no way, you can't walk. But I come back to the idea that there must be enforcement on the part of the Guyana police force and on the part of the Ministry of Home Affairs. And we could only overcome the problem that eventually the wild drivers will be removed from the roadways and our children will be safer.
In the final few moments of this broadcast, sir, in a year's time, I always like to use a year, where does David Granger want to see the traffic department of the Guyana Police Force regarding road accidents and road deaths?
Well, I would like to see the road death tally, which, as I said, it's about 2 per week, reduced maybe to 2 per month. Drastic reduction. I would like to see more traffic policemen on the road, particularly in the vulnerable areas, and we know where those areas are. I would like to see better testing of drivers and strict enforcement of regulations which prohibit people from driving under the influence of alcohol. I'm not talking about fines, I'm talking about the prevention, the preventive aspect. We've got some heavy fines, but people seem to pay the fines and come back and turn back up on the road. So I'm looking at better enforcement. I want to see a police force which is committed to slashing the road fatality tally, to about 10% of what it is now.
Brigadier the Honorable David Granger, Opposition Leader and Leader of the People's National Congress Reform. Thank you very much, sir. It's always a pleasure. I am Malaika Ramsey. This has been another program of the Public Interest. Until next time, goodbye.